The morning sun filtered through the towering firs that lined Riverside Park in Portland, Oregon, casting dappled shadows across the manicured lawns. Officer arrived at precisely 8:47 a.m., 15 minutes before the community event was scheduled to begin. He drove his patrol car slowly through the parking lot, mentally preparing himself for what he knew would be a predictable day. The same demonstrations he'd conducted dozens of times before, the same questions from curious children, the same grateful smiles from parents appreciating their local police force's outreach efforts. Beside him in the vehicle sat Max, his 4-year-old German Shepherd partner and closest companion on the force. Max had been sleeping soundly, his large head resting against the window, his dark eyes peaceful in the morning light. The dog stirred as cut the engine, immediately alert despite the early hour. 8 years of police training had instilled in Max an almost supernatural ability to sense when work was about to begin. The dog's ears perked up, his muscular body tensing with anticipation. Reached over and scratched behind Max's ears, a ritual they'd performed countless mornings over their years together. "Today's going to be a good day, buddy," said softly, though he didn't truly believe his own words. He'd been on the force for 17 years, and somewhere around year 10, the routine had become exactly that, routine. The community events were important, he knew that intellectually. Building relationships between law enforcement and civilians was crucial for public trust and safety, but couldn't help the slight sense of monotony that accompanied these Saturday morning demonstrations. He loved Max with a depth that surprised him, loved the dog's unwavering loyalty and incredible instincts. But lately, even their bond had settled into a comfortable, predictable rhythm. Stepped out of the vehicle and opened the back door, allowing Max to leap out onto the grass with practiced grace. The dog moved with the confidence of a working animal who understood his purpose. Together, they walked toward the designated demonstration area near the playground, where volunteers had already begun setting up folding tables and signage. The banners read "Community Safety Event" and "Meet Your Local K-9 Unit," with colorful illustrations of police dogs and children. Several other officers were present, along with 2 other K-9 units, Officer Jennifer Santos with her Belgian Duke, and Officer Robert Williams with his German Shepherd, Diesel. The crowd began arriving around 9:15 a.m. Families emerged from cars with children in tow, kids with balloon-painted faces, teenagers on skateboards giving the event a cautious glance, parents with strollers and multiple bags of supplies for a day in the park. The weather was perfect, that rare October morning in Portland when the clouds parted and genuine sunshine broke through, warming the cool air. Vendors had set up booths selling food and drinks, and a local band was tuning instruments near the main stage, where community leaders would speak later in the afternoon. Positioned himself in his designated area with Max, setting out the demonstration markers and agility equipment that the dog would navigate. The routine was so ingrained that could perform it practically with his eyes closed. He'd start with basic commands: sit, stay, down, heel. Then he'd move into the agility course, having Max jump through hoops and navigate weaving poles. If the crowd was particularly engaged, he might do a controlled bite work demonstration, showing how Max could apprehend a suspect in a padded suit while maintaining precise control. The whole presentation took about 20 minutes, and then he'd answer questions from families, while Max received petting and affection from children. By 10:30 a.m., a considerable crowd had gathered around in Max's station. Children pressed close, their eyes wide with fascination as Max demonstrated a perfect sit-stay command despite the distraction of so much attention. Found himself falling into his well-practiced patter, explaining K-9 unit selection processes, describing Max's training regimen, answering the inevitable question about whether Max ever turned off his police dog mode. He delivered his lines with professional warmth, but internally, he felt like an actor reciting lines he'd memorized years ago. The morning progressed predictably. One little boy asked if Max ever got scared, explained that fear wasn't really part of a police dog's emotional repertoire. They were bred and trained for courage. A teenage girl asked about Max's diet, discussed the high-protein requirements for working dogs. A grandmother expressed amazement at Max's ability to respond to hand signals, demonstrated the communication system. Everything proceeded exactly as it always did. Around 11:00 a.m., as was in the middle of guiding Max through the weaving poles with increasing speed, something shifted in the atmosphere. Noticed it subconsciously at first, a subtle change in the energy around his demonstration area, though he couldn't immediately identify its source. He continued his performance, guiding Max smoothly through the poles while maintaining his commentary about the importance of agility training for police dogs. That's when he saw her. A small girl, no more than 3 years old, had broken away from her mother's side and was wandering toward his station. She wore a faded pink dress that had seen better days, its hem slightly torn, and clutched a stuffed rabbit toy so worn that its original color was almost indecipherable beneath years of wear and love. The child moved with an uncertain gait, her eyes fixed on Max with an intensity that was immediately striking. There was something in her gaze, something open and searching and vulnerable all at once. The girl's mother came hurrying after her, her face flushed with embarrassment and concern. She was a woman in her early 30s, judged, with tired eyes that suggested sleepless nights and worry lines that seemed etched too deeply for her age. She wore simple, practical clothing, jeans and a faded blue sweater, and her dark hair was pulled back in a utilitarian ponytail. When she reached her daughter, she immediately began apologizing too, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I'm so sorry," the woman said breathlessly, placing a gentle hand on the little girl's shoulder. "She got away from me. She has autism and sometimes she just wanders when something catches her attention. I didn't mean to interrupt your demonstration." Felt something shift inside his chest, a sudden awakening from the comfortable numbness that had characterized his morning. He looked at the mother's anxious face, then at the little girl's intense focus on Max, and something in him responded to this moment with unexpected presence. This wasn't routine. This was real. "No interruption at all," said, and he meant it completely. He turned his full attention to the woman and child, setting aside the rehearsed script he'd been following all morning. "What's your daughter's name?" "Emma," the mother replied, then added quickly, "I'm Sarah, by the way. Emma's 3 years old." Knelt down slightly, bringing himself closer to Emma's eye level. The little girl didn't look away from Max, her entire body language communicating a focus so intense it was almost palpable. Suddenly understood that this moment, this ordinary Saturday at a community event, had the potential to become something more than routine. He could feel it in his bones, a kind of knowing that sometimes visited him in his work, the sense that circumstances were aligning in a way that mattered. He smiled at Sarah, then turned his attention back to Emma, waiting to see what would happen next. Sarah felt her heart pounding as she watched Officer kneel down to Emma's level. She'd learned over the past 3 years to recognize the exact moment when people's patience began to wear thin with her daughter. The polite smile that became slightly strained, the eyes that shifted away when Emma failed to respond to direct questions or engage in expected social behaviors. But this officer seemed different. There was something in his expression, a genuine openness, a lack of judgment, that made Sarah's shoulders relax slightly, though the constant anxiety that had become her baseline never fully dissipated. "Emma's 3 years old," Sarah repeated, then added information she'd learned to volunteer early in any interaction. "She has autism." She watched Officer's face to see if comprehension would spark the typical response she'd encountered countless times before. The sympathetic head tilt. The "oh, I'm so sorry" that, while well-intentioned, always made her feel like her daughter was a tragedy requiring pity rather than a unique human being deserving genuine connection. But simply nodded, his attention remaining fully on Emma, who continued to stare at Max with an intensity that bordered on spiritual. Sarah had become intimately acquainted with her daughter's autism spectrum disorder over 3 years of doctor's appointments, therapy sessions, educational evaluations, and countless nights spent researching late into the early morning hours. Emma had been diagnosed at 18 months, when it became clear that she wasn't developing language at typical rates. By age 2, while other children her age were stringing together two-word phrases and asking endless questions, Emma remained almost entirely silent. The few words she did speak were single utterances, usually associated with distress or extreme need, words like no, help, and hurt, that seemed to emerge from her only when she was overwhelmed beyond her capacity to manage. The speech therapist had been kind but honest. Emma's prognosis was uncertain. Some children on the autism spectrum developed robust language skills eventually. Others remained nonverbal or minimally verbal throughout their lives. The variability was one of the most challenging aspects of autism. There was no way to predict Emma's trajectory with certainty. Would she eventually speak in complete sentences? Would she develop the capacity for meaningful communication with others? Would she be able to attend regular school, hold relationships, live independently? These questions kept Sarah awake at night, her mind spiraling through infinite possibilities, some hopeful and others devastating. Sarah had dedicated herself entirely to Emma's development and therapy. She'd quit her job as a marketing coordinator at a mid-sized firm, something her husband Daniel had supported, but that had created financial strain on their household. She attended every appointment, speech therapy 3 times weekly, occupational therapy twice weekly, behavioral therapy once weekly, and monthly appointments with Emma's developmental pediatrician. She read everything available about autism intervention strategies, implementing techniques at home, playing educational videos, creating visual schedules, and establishing routines designed to help Emma's developing brain organize information and predict what came next. But despite all her efforts, despite the thousands of dollars spent on therapy, despite the countless hours of intensive work, Emma remained trapped in her silent world. The progress had been glacially slow, each new word or communication attempt celebrated as a monumental victory, yet still leaving Emma so far behind her peer group that the gap seemed to widen with each passing month. Other children her age were having conversations, asking questions, singing songs, telling jokes. Emma pointed. Emma occasionally vocalized in ways that barely resembled language. Emma watched the world from behind an invisible glass wall. The social isolation had been one of the hardest aspects for Sarah to witness. At preschool, Emma didn't play with other children. She played near them, parallel to them but not with them. Other children had learned to mostly ignore her, uncertain how to interact with a classmate who didn't respond to their attempts at friendship. Sarah had watched her daughter at playground gatherings, standing alone while other children ran and laughed and built friendships. She'd seen the confusion in other parents' eyes when they didn't know how to interact with Emma, the subtle discomfort when Emma didn't respond to their friendly questions or greetings. The emotional toll on Sarah herself had been substantial. She'd experienced postpartum depression after Emma's birth, which had lifted around month 8. But the depression that accompanied the autism diagnosis felt different, deeper, more intractable, more wrapped up in grief and worry about her daughter's future. She'd attended therapy sessions of her own where she'd talked about feelings of helplessness, guilt, irrational, her therapist assured her but persistent nonetheless, and profound worry about Emma's quality of life. Would Emma ever have friends? Would she ever fall in love? Would she ever achieve independence, or would Sarah be her permanent caregiver? Daniel, Emma's father, had been supportive in his way, but he processed things differently. He threw himself into research, reading studies about intervention outcomes and genetic factors in autism. He'd become quietly angry at what he perceived as society's inadequate support systems for families like theirs. He worried about money, about whether their insurance would continue covering therapy, about whether they'd need to move to a different state or district with better special education services. His love for Emma was undeniable, but so was his anxiety about the future. Sarah had become the primary emotional anchor for the family, holding everyone together while managing her own grief and worry. She'd learned to celebrate small victories. The day Emma had used the word mama, deliberately rather than accidentally. The time Emma had engaged in 5 minutes of parallel play with another child. The moment Emma had initiated physical contact with Sarah's mother by hugging her leg. That morning at Riverside Park, Sarah had been running on her typical fuel of hope and desperation. She'd heard that certain animals had calming effects on children with autism, that the gentle, non-judgmental presence of dogs sometimes created safe spaces where communication could emerge. She'd wanted to attend the community event for months, working up the courage to navigate the crowds and overstimulation alongside a child who struggled with sensory input. The park was crowded, louder than Sarah typically exposed Emma to, filled with unexpected stimuli. But she'd thought maybe, just maybe, seeing the police dogs might provide something therapeutic. Now, watching officers' genuine openness, watching Emma's intense focus on Max, Sarah felt something shift within her. It was a fragile thing, this hope. She'd learned through painful experience not to build her expectations too high. But there was something about this moment, something about the way officers' body language communicated respect and genuine interest in Emma as a person rather than a problem to be managed, that made Sarah's tired heart beat a little faster. She watched her daughter, this beautiful child who lived in a world so different from the one around her, and she whispered a prayer, something she didn't do often but returned to in moments of profound vulnerability. Just let her have one moment of real connection, she silently pleaded to whatever forces governed the universe. Just one moment where someone truly sees her and she feels genuinely understood. Sarah had no way of knowing that this moment, this ordinary Saturday morning at a community event, was about to become the turning point in her daughter's life. She had no way of knowing that the next few minutes would contain the seeds of transformation that would eventually reshape Emma's trajectory. All she knew was that her daughter was staring at a police dog with more focus and intention than Sarah had witnessed in 3 years. And somehow, miraculously, an officer of the law was responding with unexpected gentleness and genuine interest. In that moment, Sarah allowed herself to hope. Officer remained in his kneeling position, his body language open and unthreatening as he maintained a respectful distance from Emma. He didn't attempt to force interaction or make the typical cooing sounds that adults often made around young children. Instead, he simply existed in that space with Emma, allowing the girl to process whatever she was experiencing at her own pace. Max, sensing the shift in energy, had settled into a calm sitting position, his muscular frame relaxed but alert, his dark eyes following Emma's gaze. Sarah watched this interaction unfold, her mind racing with a mixture of hope and trepidation. She'd seen too many well-intentioned adults become frustrated with Emma's lack of response, interpreting her silence as rudeness or defiance rather than understanding it as simply how Emma's neurology functioned. But Officer seemed genuinely comfortable with the silence, not rushing to fill it with words or demands for engagement. This itself felt revolutionary to Sarah, who was accustomed to people trying to fix her daughter or get her to perform expected behaviors. Several minutes passed in this quiet moment. Around them, the park continued its Saturday morning rhythm. Children laughed on the playground equipment, vendors called out their wares, the local band played cheerful music from the main stage. But in their small corner of the world, time seemed to slow. Emma's breathing had become slower, deeper, her shoulders relaxing from their typical tense position. Sarah recognized the signs of her daughter entering one of her rare states of calm focus. This was what Emma's occupational therapist called regulated engagement, a state where Emma's nervous system had achieved equilibrium, and her mind was able to process her environment without the constant noise of sensory overwhelm. Emma's eyes remained fixed on Max, studying the dog with the intensity of a scientist examining a fascinating specimen. She took in every detail, The texture of Max's fur, the way his ears shifted slightly in response to distant sounds, the gentle rise and fall of his breathing, the knowing expression in his eyes. Emma had always been drawn to animals, perhaps because they didn't demand verbal communication, didn't judge her silence, didn't try to force her into social interactions that felt overwhelming. At home, she spent hours watching their cat, Shadow, observing the animal's movements with rapt attention. But Max represented something different, a larger, more commanding presence, more actively engaged with the world around him. Then gradually, Emma began moving. It was slow, deliberate movement, the kind of intentional action that suggested Emma was making a conscious decision rather than acting on impulse. She shifted her small body closer to Max, approaching the large dog with a combination of curiosity and caution that suggested she understood, on some instinctive level, that this was a powerful animal deserving of respect. Max remained perfectly still, his training evident in his complete lack of reaction. The dog didn't lunge, didn't jump, didn't invade Emma's space. He simply waited as if he understood the significance of this moment. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had warned Officer about Emma's autism, but she hadn't mentioned one crucial detail. Emma rarely initiated physical contact with anyone outside her immediate family. The exceptions were so rare that Sarah could count them on one hand. There had been the time Emma had spontaneously hugged her grandmother's leg, an event so momentous that Sarah's mother had called it one of the most meaningful moments of her life. There was the occasional situation where Emma would allow Daniel to hold her without immediately trying to escape, but deliberate, initiated contact with a stranger, that was virtually non-existent in Emma's behavioral repertoire. As Emma moved into close proximity with Max, Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. She recognized what she was witnessing, a breakthrough moment, a crack in the wall of her daughter's isolation, a sign that connection was possible even with something Emma had just met moments ago. Then Emma did something that would become the catalyst for everything that followed. She leaned forward, tilting her small head toward Max's ear, and she whispered. The whisper was so quiet, so delicate, that only those standing in immediate proximity could hear it, heard it, a soft murmur of words in a child's barely audible voice. Sarah heard it and felt her knees nearly buckle. An elderly woman who had been watching the demonstration heard it and gasped slightly, her hand flying to her chest. A teenage boy standing nearby heard it and immediately reached for his phone, some instinct telling him that he was witnessing something momentous worth capturing. No one could make out the actual words Emma spoke. It was impossible to discern whether she was saying actual language or simply vocalizing sounds that mimicked the pattern of speech. But what mattered, what made the moment transcendent, was that Emma had initiated communication. Emma had used her voice deliberately, had directed her words toward another being, had engaged in an act of connection that she hadn't performed in any meaningful way since her diagnosis. The whisper lasted perhaps 5 seconds, though it felt suspended in time far longer than that. Emma's tiny lips moved, forming words or sounds in the softest possible volume, her entire body leaning into Max with a trust that seemed almost impossible given her typical wariness with unfamiliar beings and situations. Sarah watched her daughter's face, nodding the concentration etched across Emma's small features, the way her eyes remained locked on Max's, the subtle relaxation of her jaw that suggested she was engaging her vocal apparatus with intention. When Emma finished speaking, she remained positioned close to Max, her body still, her breathing audible in the sudden quiet. It was as if the entire universe was holding its breath, waiting to see how Max would respond to this unprecedented communication from a child he'd just met. Felt something shift in his chest, a profound recognition of the importance of what had just occurred. In his 17 years as a police officer, in his 8 years working with Max, he had experienced many meaningful moments. But this felt different. This felt sacred. This felt like witnessing a fundamental moment of human connection, A moment where barriers had been breached, where two beings from entirely different worlds had somehow found a way to communicate on a level that transcended normal understanding. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, tears streaming openly down her face now. She was witnessing her daughter do something that 3 years of intensive therapy had struggled to accomplish. Emma had spoken, not in a practiced way forced through repetitive drills, not as a response to a direct prompt, but spontaneously, deliberately, in her own words directed toward a being she was choosing to communicate with. The teenage boy continued filming, his phone's camera capturing what would eventually become a moment seen by over 50 million people around the world. But in this instant, none of them understood the magnitude of what was occurring. They simply knew that something extraordinary was happening in their midst, something that spoke to the profound mysteries of connection and healing that human science was only beginning to understand. The moment hung suspended in time, pregnant with possibility and unspoken significance. Emma's whisper had faded into silence, but its echoes seemed to reverberate through the very fabric of reality, touching everyone within earshot with a sense of wonder. Officer held his breath, unsure what would happen next, knowing only that he was witnessing something beyond his understanding, something that transcended the boundaries between species and rational explanation. Max remained absolutely still for several heartbeats after Emma finished speaking. The German shepherd's body language didn't change. His posture remained alert but relaxed, his breathing steady and controlled. 8 years of police training had taught Max to read situations, to assess threats, to respond to commands with split-second precision. But in this moment, no training protocol covered what Max's instincts were telling him about this small, vulnerable child who had chosen to share something precious with him. Then slowly, deliberately slowly, with a grace that seemed impossible for a 90-pound dog, Max turned his massive head toward Emma. The movement was fluid, controlled, almost tender in its gentleness. This was not a dog performing a trick or responding to a command. This was a living being making a conscious choice, responding to something Emma had communicated that resonated with something deep within Max's core. Sarah's hands trembled as she watched her daughter and the dog. She'd seen Max perform countless obedience demonstrations at the park, the sitting, the staying, the controlled aggression of bite work. But this was different. This was something unprompted, something that came from a place beyond training, something that suggested Max understood on a fundamental level the significance of Emma's communication. It was as if the dog recognized that he was being trusted with something infinitely precious, and he was responding with the appropriate reverence. What happened next made Sarah's knees literally weaken. Max pressed his large head gently against Emma's small shoulder in a gesture that could only be described as an embrace. It wasn't a trained behavior, hadn't cued it, hadn't given any command. It was pure instinct, pure emotion, pure recognition passing between two beings who should have had no way to truly understand each other, yet somehow did. The German shepherd's massive frame curved slightly, his body positioning itself to protect rather than intimidate, his head resting against the small child with a tenderness that seemed almost impossible given his size and strength. But what made the moment truly extraordinary was what happened in Max's eyes. The dog's dark eyes closed gently, his entire body relaxing into a state of what could only be described as peace. It was as if Max was absorbing something from Emma, some profound communication that went beyond words, beyond the whisper that had been spoken into his ear. The dog's breathing synchronized with Emma's, the two of them falling into a rhythm that seemed choreographed by some higher intelligence, some universal force that understood connection at a level humans barely comprehended. The elderly woman watching from several feet away felt tears streaming down her own face. She'd been a teacher for 40 years and had witnessed countless moments of human growth and connection, but she'd never seen anything quite like this. She watched the enormous police dog cradling a tiny autistic child with such gentleness, such obvious emotional intelligence, such unmistakable understanding of what that child needed in that moment. The teenager who had begun filming immediately called his friends over, his phone's camera capturing every second of what was unfolding. He didn't understand why he knew this was important. He was only 17, caught in that liminal space between childhood and adulthood, where profound moments sometimes registered before rational understanding could catch up. But something in his bones told him that he was witnessing history, that he was documenting something that mattered in ways he couldn't yet articulate. Emma's response to Max's gesture was almost as profound as the gesture itself. A smile spread across Emma's small face, not the polite, forced smile that sometimes appeared when adults tried too hard to engage her, not the grimace that emerged when she was stressed or overwhelmed. This was a genuine smile, a full-face expression of joy that seemed to illuminate her entire being from within. It was the kind of smile that only appears when a person experiences true recognition, true understanding, true connection with another soul. Sarah had seen her daughter smile maybe 5 times in 3 years, rare enough that each occurrence was memorable, precious, almost miraculous. But this smile was different. This smile suggested that Emma was experiencing something transformative, something that was shifting her at a level deeper than conscious understanding. This smile communicated pure, uncomplicated joy. Found himself standing slowly, his own eyes beginning to water despite decades of police training that had taught him to maintain emotional composure in all circumstances. He'd worked with Max for 8 years, had come to understand the dog's personality, had appreciated his intelligence and loyalty, but he'd never witnessed Max respond to a human in this way. The dog was known for being friendly with children. All police dogs were trained to be comfortable around civilians, especially young people. But this transcended friendliness. This was recognition. This was love. Sarah moved forward slowly, almost without conscious volition, drawn toward her daughter and the extraordinary dog like a moth to flame. She placed one trembling hand on Max's back, feeling the warmth of the dog's body, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the palpable sense of peace emanating from the animal. She looked down at Emma's face, seeing her daughter's smile, witnessing the contentment that had replaced the usual anxiety and guardedness that typically characterized Emma's expression. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, the words barely audible. She felt something breaking open inside her chest, all the worry, all the fear, all the grief she'd been carrying since Emma's diagnosis suddenly encountering an enormous tide of hope and possibility. Multiple onlookers had now noticed what was happening. A small crowd had begun to gather around Emma and Max, sensing that something extraordinary was occurring. People were pulling out their phones, cameras, recording devices, capturing the moment from various angles. But they remained silent, respectful of what was clearly a sacred moment, understanding through some universal human instinct that words would only diminish the profundity of what they were witnessing. The park's ambient noise seemed to fade into the background. The children's laughter became muted, the band's music grew distant, the vendors' calls softened. It was as if the universe itself had become quiet, had created a sacred space for this connection to exist undisturbed and unsullied by the chaos of the ordinary world. Emma's small hand reached out and touched Max's face, her fingers stroking the dog's soft fur with wonder and tenderness. The gesture was so gentle, so full of reverence, that it suggested Emma understood she was in the presence of something sacred. And Max responded by remaining perfectly still, allowing himself to be touched, to be honored, to be seen by this small child in a way that transcended all species boundaries and all rational understanding. In that moment, surrounded by stunned witnesses and bathed in morning sunshine, something fundamental shifted. The universe had conspired to create an intersection point between two souls who desperately needed to find each other. And on an ordinary Saturday morning at Riverside Park in Portland, Oregon, the veil between isolation and connection had been pierced forever. By the time Emma and Max had fully separated from their embrace, At least 17 different people had captured some portion of the moment on their phones. The teenager who had first started filming, a high school senior named Tyler, no relation to Emma's family, had recorded the entire sequence from Emma's initial approach through Max's gentle head press and Emma's radiating smile. His phone's battery indicator had flashed into the red zone during the recording, but he'd managed to capture the crucial moments before it died, leaving him staring at a black screen even as his mind replayed what he'd just witnessed. Tyler had texted the video to his friend group immediately, knowing somehow that what he'd recorded was special. His friend, an ironic name, given the officer involved, had suggested uploading it to TikTok. "This is literally one of the most wholesome things I've ever seen," had texted. Tyler had hesitated for approximately 30 seconds before creating a TikTok account, something he'd previously refused to do, considering the platform frivolous. He uploaded the video at 11:47 a.m. that Saturday morning with the caption, "Nonverbal autistic girl whispers to police dog. His reaction will melt your heart." He hit post and then watched as the video sat in relative obscurity for the first 45 minutes. Then something shifted. The first engagement came from a TikTok account dedicated to dogs with large followings. The video had been duetted and shared to their 2.3 million followers. Within minutes, the engagement numbers began climbing exponentially. Likes started accumulating at a rate Tyler had never witnessed before. 50 likes became 100, which became 500, which became thousands. Comments flooded in from users around the world, each person apparently experiencing the same emotional response that Tyler himself had felt when witnessing the moment in person. "I'm literally crying," one comment read. "This is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," wrote another. "Dogs understand things we don't," someone else posted philosophically. By early evening, just 8 hours after Tyler's initial upload, the video had accumulated 1.2 million views. TikTok's algorithm, recognizing the unusual engagement rate and the emotional resonance the video was generating, began featuring it on the For You page of millions of users. The video appeared on the feeds of teenagers in Tokyo, mothers in Mumbai, teachers in Toronto, social workers in Stockholm. People from every continent, every culture, every walk of life began watching the 47-second clip of a small child and a police dog experiencing something that transcended explanation. By Saturday evening, the video had been shared to Instagram, where it began accumulating millions more views. Instagram Reels users were passing it to their followers, tagging friends with messages like, "Watch this and try not to cry," or "This is what humanity needs to see." The emotional resonance was undeniable. In a world filled with conflict, division, and negativity, here was a moment of pure connection, of love that transcended all boundaries, of hope made tangible in the form of a child's smile and a dog's gentle response. Facebook users, predominantly older demographics, began sharing the video to their personal pages and dedicated groups. Grandmothers shared it with other grandmothers. Autism advocacy groups shared it among their communities. Teachers shared it with colleagues. Mental health professionals shared it with colleagues, recognizing the therapeutic potential illustrated in the moment. The video began appearing on news aggregator sites, gaining traction among journalists who understood that the story had immediate viral potential. By Sunday morning, Twitter was ablaze with the hashtag #MaxandEmma. News outlets began picking up the story, first local Portland stations, then regional news networks, then national networks. Cable news producers understood that the video provided exactly what their audiences craved: a feel-good story, a moment of genuine human connection, a respite from the typical diet of conflict and negativity that dominated their programming. Autistic girl's tender moment with police dog touches hearts worldwide, one headline read. "The connection between this child and dog will restore your faith in humanity," another proclaimed. One 3-year-old's whisper sparks global conversation about human-animal bonds, a third stated. The video had reached 5.7 million views by Sunday afternoon. Major news networks began posting their own versions of the clip to their YouTube channels, where it quickly accumulated millions of additional views. Entertainment news shows featured the story in their segments. Morning show hosts teared up while introducing the video to their nationwide audiences. International news agencies picked up the story, translating the headlines into dozens of languages, sharing the moment with people who had never heard of Portland, Oregon, or American police departments, but who nonetheless understood the universal language of love and connection that the video communicated. Officer's phone began ringing incessantly on Sunday morning. His police department's public relations officer, a woman named Detective Sarah, had alerted him to the video's viral status. Initially, had been skeptical. He'd seen viral videos before. Most were either sensationalized, manipulated, or ultimately shallow. But when he finally watched the footage that Tyler had captured, found himself moved to tears, seeing the moment from an external perspective that made him realize just how extraordinary it truly had been. The police department received interview requests from major networks. Good Morning America wanted to feature Officer and Max. NBC News wanted to do a segment. The Today Show requested an appearance. International media outlets wanted commentary and interviews. The department's public relations officer fielded call after call, trying to determine which interviews would be appropriate and beneficial. Social media users began creating fan art dedicated to Max and Emma. Artists drew illustrations of the moment, capturing the tenderness in drawings ranging from to abstract, from anime style to oil paintings. One artist created a beautiful watercolor that spread across multiple platforms, accumulating hundreds of thousands of shares. Musicians began composing music inspired by the moment. Everything from orchestral pieces to hip-hop beats incorporated elements inspired by the video. Psychology professors began sharing the video with their classes, using it as a discussion point for courses on animal therapy, human development, and neurodiversity. Autism advocacy organizations featured the video prominently on their websites, using it as evidence of the unique and profound ways that autistic individuals experience and express connection differently from neurotypical people. Animal behaviorists offered scientific explanations for Max's apparent emotional response, theorizing about mirror neurons, canine empathy, and the dog's intuitive recognition of Emma's vulnerability. By Monday morning, just 36 hours after Tyler's initial upload, the video had been viewed over 12 million times across various platforms. The hashtag MaxandEmma was still trending on Twitter, competing with major news stories for prominence in the trending topics. International versions of the hashtag had emerged in Spanish, French, German, Japanese, Chinese, and countless other languages. The moment that had begun as a simple, unplanned interaction at a community event had transformed into a global phenomenon. Emma, who had barely spoken 36 words in her entire life, had become known to over 50 million people around the world through a 47-second video. Officer, who had considered his Saturday demonstrations routine and predictable, had found himself at the center of a media storm. And Max, a 4-year-old German Shepherd police dog, had become an unlikely symbol of the healing power of connection. None of them had anticipated that this moment would change not just their own lives, but would initiate a broader conversation about autism, animal therapy, and the profound ways that humans and animals could connect across the boundaries of species and neurology. The whisper heard in a park had become a roar heard around the world. Sarah didn't sleep well on Sunday night. Her mind kept replaying the moment at the park, kept analyzing what she'd witnessed, kept attempting to process the significance of what Emma had accomplished. She lay beside her sleeping husband Daniel, staring at the ceiling of their modest bedroom, her heart racing with a combination of hope and fear. She'd learned through painful experience not to build expectations too high, not to believe that one good moment meant lasting change. But something felt different about Sunday's events. Something felt fundamental. Monday morning arrived gray and overcast, typical October weather in Portland. Sarah went through her usual routine with Emma, helping her dress, preparing breakfast, attempting to engage her in morning communication routines. Emma seemed calm, perhaps slightly more engaged than usual, but Sarah told herself not to read too much into it. One spectacular moment at the park didn't necessarily predict broader behavioral changes. The therapists had been clear. Autism was a lifelong condition. Progress, when it occurred, typically came incrementally, one small victory at a time. That's when Emma said her first sentence. Sarah was standing at the kitchen sink, loading breakfast dishes into the dishwasher, when she heard her daughter's voice from the small table where Emma sat coloring with markers. It was Emma's voice, that familiar, slightly raspy tone that emerged so rarely it was almost like hearing a stranger speak. Max, where Max? 4 words. 4 simple words strung together in grammatically imperfect but unmistakably intentional communication. Sarah's hands froze mid-motion, the plate she was holding nearly slipping from her grasp. She slowly turned to face her daughter, barely breathing, terrified that any sudden movement or sound would shatter this impossible moment. Emma, Sarah asked carefully, her voice barely above a whisper, Did you just talk? Emma looked up from her coloring, her small face concentrating. Max, want see Max. 2 more sentences, 8 words total. Sarah literally staggered backward, gripping the kitchen counter to steady herself. In 3 years, Emma had never strung together this many words, never initiated conversation like this, never expressed desire in such clear, unmistakable language. Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone and called Emma's speech therapist, Dr. Hammond. The phone rang 4 times before answered, and Sarah could barely form coherent sentences as she described what had just occurred. Sarah, slow down, said, her professional tone shifting to something more warm, more personally invested. Are you telling me that Emma spoke 4 complete sentences this morning? 8 words total across 3 utterances, Sarah corrected, her voice shaking. She asked about Max. She asked where Max was and said she wanted to see him. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Had been Emma's speech therapist for 2 years and understood her case intimately. She knew that this kind of spontaneous, unprompted language production was extraordinarily atypical for Emma's profile. That's remarkable progress, finally said carefully. Bring her in for her regular Thursday session. I'd like to conduct a formal assessment to understand what's happening. By Tuesday morning, Sarah had documented that Emma had spoken a total of approximately 200 words over the previous day and a half, an astronomical increase from her baseline. Emma had asked about Max repeatedly. She'd asked her father, what that? While pointing at objects around the house. She'd even attempted to sing along with a children's song playing on the television, her voice thin and uncertain but unmistakably present. Sarah found herself crying multiple times throughout Tuesday. These weren't tears of sadness, though she was accustomed to those. These were tears of overwhelming hope, of gratitude, of acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted in her daughter's capacity and willingness to communicate. She found herself replaying videos of Emma on her phone, marveling at the footage of her daughter whispering to Max, studying Max's response with new understanding. On Wednesday, Emma's preschool teacher, Ms. Jennifer, called Sarah in the middle of the morning. I don't know what's happening with Emma, Jennifer said, her voice filled with wonder, but something has changed. She engaged with another child today. She used words. She attempted to participate in group activities. I've never seen her like this. By Thursday's therapy session with Emma had accumulated what Sarah estimated to be over 500 words across the preceding 4 days, conducted a formal assessment, and her findings were remarkable. Emma's expressive language had increased by an estimated 300%. Her receptive language comprehension appeared sharper. Her willingness to engage socially had increased notably. Most significantly, Emma had demonstrated initiation of communication. She was no longer waiting for others to direct her. She was taking active steps to communicate her thoughts and desires. "Something catalytic occurred at that park," explained to Sarah after conducting the assessment. "I can't offer a scientific explanation for this level of improvement happening this quickly. Typically, we see gradual gains over months or years. This is unprecedented in my experience. Whatever happened with that dog, whatever connection Emma made, it appears to have unlocked something. She's accessing language centers that previously seemed inaccessible. Her confidence in communication has skyrocketed." Sarah found herself sharing the park video with and watched as tears appeared in her therapist's eyes. "That dog," said quietly, "that dog somehow communicated to Emma that communication was safe, that her voice mattered, that connection was possible. And Emma believed him. Whatever Emma heard from that dog, whatever that moment represented, it gave her permission to speak." By the following week, Emma's occupational therapist, Washington, reported similar observations. Emma's sensory regulation appeared to have improved. She was tolerating stimulation better. Her anxiety levels seemed reduced. She was more willing to attempt new tasks and engage in activities that previously overwhelmed her nervous system. Sarah shared the video with her own therapist, Dr. James, and found herself finally allowing herself to truly grieve the earlier years. In Dr. James's office, Sarah wept deep, cathartic sobs that seemed to release years of accumulated worry and fear. "I don't know if Emma will continue progressing like this," Sarah said between tears. "I'm terrified that this will plateau, that we'll hit a ceiling and be back where we started. But right now, in this moment, my daughter is speaking. My daughter is trying. My daughter is here in the world with us, in a way she wasn't before." Officer, meanwhile, had received a message through the police department's social media from Sarah. In it, she'd included videos of Emma speaking, asking for Max, attempting new words, engaging with her preschool class. She'd written, "I don't know how to thank you or Max for what you've given my daughter. I don't know if I believe in miracles, but Emma's transformation feels like one. Every word she speaks, I think of Max, of that moment, of whatever it was that passed between them. You've given us hope." Had read the message on his personal time, tears streaming down his face as he watched Emma's halting but determined attempts at language. He forwarded the videos to Max's veterinarian and to the police department's K-9 coordinator, captioning the messages simply, "This is what we do this for." The police department began receiving letters from families around the world describing their own children's connections with animals, their own experiences with autism, their own moments of breakthrough and hope. The department's public relations officer suggested that Officer and Max consider expanding their community engagement to specifically include therapeutic visits with children with special needs. Meanwhile, Emma's transformation continued. By the end of that first month, Emma had progressed from nonverbal to minimally verbal to actively communicative. She'd formed her first friendship with a classmate. She'd participated in her first group activity at preschool without becoming overwhelmed. She'd taken her first voluntary step towards social engagement with peers. Every night, Emma asked about Max. Every day, Sarah found herself grateful for the moment at the park, for the teenager who had filmed it, for the universe's mysterious choreography that had placed Emma and Max in the same location at precisely the right moment. She didn't fully understand what had happened. None of the professionals could offer a complete scientific explanation. But understanding didn't matter. What mattered was that her daughter, her beautiful, special, complex daughter, had found her voice. The viral video had been circulating for approximately 3 weeks when the first organized response emerged from the animal therapy community. Dr. the director of the Pacific Northwest Institute for Animal-Assisted Therapy, had watched Emma's whisper become a global phenomenon and recognized an unprecedented opportunity. She contacted Officer directly, requesting a meeting to discuss expanding therapeutic animal interactions specifically targeting children with autism spectrum disorders and other developmental challenges. Arrived at the Institute's offices in downtown Portland on a rainy November afternoon, Max at his side as always. Doctor greeted them in a lobby decorated with photographs of dogs, horses, and other animals engaged in therapeutic work with children and adults. She was a woman in her late 50s with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who had dedicated her entire professional life to understanding human-animal connection. "Officer Max," Doctor said warmly, extending her hand. "Thank you for meeting with me. I wanted to talk to you about something that I believe could transform our entire field." Over coffee, Doctor explained her vision. The Institute had been conducting animal therapy research for 12 years, but funding had been limited and recognition minimal. Most major medical centers and educational institutions remained skeptical about the therapeutic value of animal-assisted interventions, viewing them as supplementary rather than substantive. But Emma's documented transformation, from nonverbal to communicative in a matter of weeks, provided compelling anecdotal evidence that something significant could occur when vulnerable children connected with specially trained animals. "I want to develop a program," Doctor explained, "specifically designed around your and Max's model. We train additional police dogs and pair them with officers interested in community therapeutic engagement. We'd also work with other animal therapy practitioners, handlers with cats, rabbits, horses, to create a comprehensive approach. Most importantly, we'd conduct rigorous scientific research documenting the outcomes for children like Emma." Found himself nodding before even fully considering the implications. Something about the proposal felt right, felt like a natural extension of what had occurred at Riverside Park. By the end of the meeting, he'd agreed to partner with the Institute, making him and Max unofficial ambassadors for the emerging field of police dog-assisted therapy. The news spread quickly through professional networks. By mid-November, universities had begun reaching out too, requesting his participation in research projects. Portland State University's Department of Psychology initiated a study examining canine-assisted intervention for children on the autism spectrum. University of Oregon researchers wanted to conduct neuroimaging studies to understand what was happening in children's brains during interactions with specially trained dogs. 3 separate universities requested permission to feature Max in their educational curricula on animal behavior and therapeutic intervention. Meanwhile, animal shelters across the country began experiencing an unprecedented surge in public interest and support. The Humane Society of the United States reported that shelter visits had increased by 40% in the weeks following Emma's video going viral. Families who had previously never considered adopting shelter animals were suddenly interested in providing homes for dogs and cats, driven in part by Emma's story and newfound understanding of animal-human connections' therapeutic potential. Local shelters in Portland received donations totaling over $400,000 in a single month. An anonymous donor contributed $2 million to establish a fund specifically for training therapy animals to work with children with special needs and other vulnerable populations. The Pacific Northwest Institute for Animal-Assisted Therapy received 3 separate major grants from foundations dedicated to pediatric health and neurodiversity research, funding that allowed them to expand their programs significantly. Police departments across the country began reconsidering their K-9 units' roles. The Los Angeles Police Department reached out to officers requesting consultation on developing their own therapeutic K-9 program. The New York Police Department did the same. Federal law enforcement agencies began discussing how to incorporate animal therapy into their community outreach initiatives. By December, over 40 different police departments had initiated programs specifically designed to bring their K-9 units into schools and therapeutic settings serving children with developmental challenges. Schools began requesting therapeutic animal visits as part of their special education programming. Teachers who had previously focused narrowly on academic instruction and behavioral management began understanding that sometimes the most profound learning occurred through non-traditional modalities like animal interaction. A special education director in Seattle reported that following a therapeutic visit from a trained therapy dog, her students had shown marked improvements in classroom engagement and peer interaction. Similar reports emerged from schools across the country. The scientific community mobilized to understand what was occurring at a neurological level. Dr. James, a neuroscientist at the University of Washington, published a preliminary research brief suggesting that interactions with calm, non-judgmental animals might facilitate neurological pathways associated with social engagement and communication in children with autism. His research hypothesized that animals didn't trigger the social anxiety that human interaction sometimes provoked in autistic children, thus providing a safer context for practicing communication and building confidence. Autism advocacy organizations began prominently featuring Emma's story in their materials, using it as evidence of the unique ways that autistic individuals experienced connection and the importance of finding individualized pathways to communication. The Autism Society of America featured Emma's video on their homepage with the caption, "Every autistic person communicates. Sometimes we just need to listen in different ways." Parents began reaching out to the police department requesting therapeutic visits with Max and other trained K-9 units. Officer received hundreds of emails and letters from families describing their own children's struggles with communication and social engagement, requesting opportunities for their children to interact with specially trained animals. The demand far exceeded what any single officer and dog could provide, spurring discussions about how to scale therapeutic animal programs to meet national need. Universities began developing formal academic programs in animal-assisted therapy. What had previously been a niche specialty field with minimal institutional support suddenly received serious academic attention. Graduate programs in counseling psychology began offering concentrations in human-animal interaction. Veterinary schools began including animal therapy components in their curricula. The field was professionalizing and expanding at an unprecedented rate. A nonprofit organization specifically dedicated to funding and coordinating therapy dog programs for children with special needs was established in December, with contributions totaling $8.5 million in its first month of operation. The organization's stated mission was to ensure that every child struggling with communication or social engagement would have access to therapeutic animal interactions, regardless of family income or geographic location. Officer found himself navigating an unexpected new reality. He was simultaneously a working police officer managing his normal duties, an advocate for therapeutic animal programs, a consultant to multiple research institutions, and an unofficial ambassador for animal-assisted therapy. Max, in addition to his police work, was being scheduled for therapeutic visits to schools, special education centers, and community organizations at a rate that required careful management to prevent overwork and stress. The police department administration, recognizing the positive community impact and the enormous goodwill being generated, formally expanded and Max's role to include scheduled therapeutic community engagement. Other officers with K-9 partners were offered opportunities to participate in the program, and several expressed strong interest. By the end of December, 6 police departments across the Pacific Northwest had established formal therapeutic K-9 programs modeled on and Max's work. By January, that number had expanded to 23 departments nationwide. By spring, over 100 police departments had established or were in the process of developing therapeutic K-9 programs, with many specifically targeting children with special needs. Emma's Whisper, That quiet moment of vulnerability and trust had sparked something far larger than anyone could have anticipated. What had begun as one child seeking connection with one dog had blossomed into a movement reshaping how law enforcement, mental health professionals, educators, and society as a whole understood the therapeutic power of human-animal connection. And at the center of it all remained Officer and Max, two beings whose chance encounter with a nonverbal autistic girl had somehow catalyzed a revolution in how America approached healing, connection, and the recognition that sometimes our most profound teachers arrive on four legs and ask nothing but to be present. 1 year had passed since that pivotal Saturday morning at Riverside Park. The autumn sun cast the same golden light across the park's lawns as it had 12 months earlier, creating a sense of cyclical completion, as if the universe was bookending this extraordinary chapter with matching imagery. The Portland Police Department had arranged a formal community appreciation ceremony to honor Officer and Max for their contributions to community safety and therapeutic engagement. But more importantly, they'd arranged for Emma to participate in the ceremony. Emma sat in the audience section reserved for special guests, her small hand clutching her mother's as she watched the stage preparations. She wore a dress her grandmother had helped her pick out, a pale yellow sundress with small embroidered flowers, and her hair was styled with carefully chosen clips. At 4 years old now, Emma bore almost no resemblance to the nonverbal child of a year ago, though traces of her earlier self remained in the subtle ways she processed sensory information, and occasionally retreated into quieter moments of observation. The transformation in Emma over the preceding 12 months had been nothing short of miraculous, though that word felt inadequate to capture the depth of change. Her vocabulary had expanded from fewer than 50 words to over 2,000. She'd progressed from nonverbal to fluent, though her communication style retained unique characteristics. Sometimes she spoke in short, direct sentences. Other times she expressed herself through detailed observations about animals, nature, and the feelings she experienced in response to sensory stimuli. Speech therapists had noted that Emma's language pattern reflected her autistic neurology, different from neurotypical communication, but no less valid, no less meaningful, no less worthy of celebration. Beyond language, Emma's entire engagement with the world had shifted fundamentally. She developed friendships with 2 classmates at her preschool. She participated in group activities without becoming overwhelmed. She initiated social interactions and expressed preferences about how she wanted to spend her time. Her anxiety levels had decreased substantially. Her sensory regulation had improved. The occupational therapist who worked with her had documented Emma's progression from severe sensory defensiveness to moderate adaptability, remarkable progress given autism's typically static nature. Most significantly, Emma had become an advocate for herself and for other children like her. She'd begun drawing pictures of Max and speaking about the experience of connection they'd shared. When adults asked her about that day at the park, Emma would describe it with a precision and emotional clarity that moved everyone who heard her account. She'd say things like, "Max understood my whisper. He listened with his whole heart. His quietness helped me find my voice." Sarah sat beside her daughter, tears streaming down her face as she watched the ceremony's progression. She'd spent the previous year navigating a strange new reality, the reality of having a daughter who spoke, who engaged, who participated in the world in ways Sarah had begun to believe might never be possible. The grief she'd been carrying since Emma's diagnosis had transformed into something more complex. Gratitude mixed with residual sadness for the early years of silence, joy tempered by awareness of the ongoing challenges autism would always present, and profound appreciation for the dog and officer who had somehow catalyzed her daughter's transformation. Daniel sat beside his wife, his arm around her shoulders, his own eyes wet with emotion. He'd returned to his engineering job after Emma's breakthrough had stabilized, but work felt less central to his identity now. He spent evenings helping Emma with homework, taking her to therapy appointments, and simply being present in a way that her early developmental challenges had sometimes prevented. The financial strain of Emma's therapy expenses remained, but their insurance had expanded coverage following the national attention to therapeutic animal programs, making the financial burden somewhat more manageable. Officer stood backstage with Max, both of them preparing for the formal presentation. Had aged noticeably in the past year. There were new lines around his eyes, his hair had more gray at the temples, but he carried himself with a sense of purpose and fulfillment that had been absent before Emma's whisper transformed his professional trajectory. Max, now 5 years old, remained in excellent health despite the increased community engagement schedule. The dog seemed to thrive on the therapeutic work, his personality subtly shifting to accommodate the gentleness required for interactions with vulnerable children. The ceremony began with police commissioners offering official recognition of officers' contributions to community engagement and therapeutic partnership. Then came the personal testimonies. A mother describing how a therapy dog visit had helped her nonverbal son speak his first sentence. A teacher explaining how therapeutic dog visits had transformed her classroom's emotional climate. A school counselor detailing how animal-assisted therapy had provided breakthrough moments for children struggling with anxiety and trauma. Then Emma was called to the stage. Sarah gently encouraged her daughter forward, and Emma walked to the podium with careful, deliberate steps. She had to stand on the small platform they'd provided to reach the microphone appropriately. She looked out at the approximately 300 people gathered, police officers, families, community members, representatives from therapeutic organizations and research institutions. Her face showed no anxiety, though her breathing was slightly faster than normal. She'd practiced what she wanted to say, but speaking before such a large crowd was still challenging for her. "My name is Emma," she began, her voice small but steady. The audience fell completely silent, every person present acutely aware that they were witnessing something profound. "1 year ago, I couldn't talk. I had lots of words inside my brain, but I couldn't get them out. Everything felt too loud and too scary. Then I met Max." Emma paused, her eyes shifting to where Officer and Max stood off to the side of the stage. "Max didn't ask me questions. He didn't try to make me talk. He just sat with me. He listened to my whisper. He understood something that nobody else understood, that I had things to say even if I couldn't say them yet. Max's quietness gave me permission to use my voice. When he put his head on my shoulder, I knew I was safe. I knew my words mattered. Max taught me that connection doesn't need words. Connection is just being with someone." There wasn't a dry eye in the auditorium. Several people were openly sobbing, moved not just by Emma's words but by the profound growth they represented, by the journey from silence to eloquent self-expression that her speech demonstrated. "I want to thank Officer and Max for changing my life," Emma continued. "I want to thank all the people who helped Max be trained to help kids like me, and I want to tell other kids who can't talk yet, it's okay. You will find your voice. Maybe it's a dog who helps you, maybe it's someone else, but you're not broken. You're just waiting for someone to understand you the way Max understood me." Emma stepped back from the microphone as the audience erupted in applause, sustained, emotional, standing ovation that went on for several minutes. Sarah was openly weeping. Daniel's arm around her was shaking with emotion. An officer found Max's collar to steady himself against the overwhelming feelings the moment had provoked. Then and Max were called to the stage for formal commendation. Emma remained present, standing beside them, and when Officer was given the microphone, he chose to speak about what Emma's journey had meant for him professionally and personally. "When I came to this job 17 years ago, I understood it as law enforcement, preventing crime, apprehending suspects, maintaining public safety. Those things remain important," said. "But Officer Max and I have learned something more profound this year. We've learned that sometimes the most important work we do isn't about enforcement at all. Sometimes it's about bearing witness to human potential. Sometimes it's about being present when a child discovers their voice. Sometimes it's about recognizing that healing doesn't follow the timelines we expect, and transformation can occur in moments we never anticipated. Reached down and placed his hand on Emma's head, a gesture of tenderness and recognition. Emma taught me that connection transcends species boundaries. She taught me that silence isn't absence. It's sometimes just waiting for the right moment, the right person, the right presence to spark something inside. Max and I will spend the rest of our lives grateful to Emma for choosing to trust us with her whisper. She changed us as profoundly as we changed her. The ceremony concluded with formal presentations, but everyone present understood that the real moment of significance had already occurred. Emma and Max's connection, captured in that 47-second video a year ago, had rippled out into a movement that was reshaping how society understood animal-assisted therapy, neurodiversity, and the profound healing potential of authentic connection. Emma and Max would continue seeing each other monthly for the rest of Max's working life. Their bond would deepen through ongoing interactions, therapeutic visits, and the unique understanding they'd developed together. Emma would continue speaking, progressing, challenging assumptions about what autism meant and what nonverbal children could eventually achieve. Officer would dedicate the remainder of his police career to therapeutic K-9 work, helping hundreds of children find their own voices through connection with specially trained dogs. And the world would remember Emma's whisper, that delicate moment of vulnerability and trust, as evidence that sometimes the most transformative moments are the quietest ones, that healing often arrives on four legs, and that when we truly listen, to children, to animals, to the subtle communications of those whose voices have been silenced by circumstance, we open ourselves to witnessing miracles. The impact of that single whisper would ripple outward for decades, touching lives and reshaping systems, in ways that no one could have predicted when a small child in a pink dress leaned toward a police dog and shared something precious with him in the morning sun at Riverside Park. Sometimes all it takes is one moment of genuine connection to change everything.